Okay, welcome to Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities. Those of you who missed, I apologize for missing the March. We had to cancel, the weather was closed, Drexel was closed, the weather was bad, so apologies for those of you who tuned in and didn't find us. I know that I received some emails on that, but we had no choice. But those of you who are joining us for the first time, as you know, this is our third year. We're in the 2018 season. We've got a series of different talks. We're up to the April talk on climate data tools, and we're going through October at least, and we'll continue from then. But the way the seminar series works, we have a different theme every month, and then we have usually between 1 and 3 speakers who talk, and then there's an opportunity for interactions with the speakers through online platform and in person. And so all the previous talks, if you're joining us for the first time, have been archived and stored on the CC Run website. And so it gives me pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Jenny Fung from Azavea here in Philadelphia, who's going to be talking about her work on climate data tools and other types of tools, GIS based. So with that, I will invite Jenny. She's our only speaker, so she'll go for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a chance for interaction. Switch to your presentation. There you go. Thanks.
Hi everyone. As you can see, my name is Jenny. I'm coming to you from a company in Philadelphia called Azavea, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about later. Today, we're talking about climate tools, climate data tools in particular. And Azavea has had the pleasure of delving into the climate space over the last 5 years. And this is sort of going to be a retrospective on the work that we've done over the last 5 years, and particularly the tools that have come out of it, of which there will be 2 to 3. The reason I say 2 to 3 instead of just an integer is because 2 of them are sort of linked together. One is an interface for the other. So my presentation is called Making Climate Data Accessible and Useful for Adaptation Planning. I want to emphasize the word useful because data really is only as useful, or is only useful when it is understandable. It can be accessible in terms of being free or out there, but if it doesn't make sense to people, they will not use it and will not affect change. So, who is Azavea? What are we doing here? So, as I mentioned, we are a software development company. Particularly, we work in the space of geospatial software, and we also do data analytics. And our mission is to apply our skills to civic, social, and environmental purposes. And so that, at a slant, brings us here to the climate space. My understanding from the participants of these talks is that you're an audience of planners, students, researchers of all sorts. So there's a lot of reasons to bring you here, but maybe not software developers. So what brings me to you today to talk about this? This picture, 2012. You're probably all familiar with this. This is Hurricane Sandy coming up the eastern seaboard in 2012. And it's caused a lot of devastation across the eastern seaboard and the Caribbean, effects of which are still being felt today as, like, for example, Jersey shores are recovering from the infrastructure damage. And at this time, we were concerned citizens, like all of you, and had not been working in the climate space. But we thought, looking at a map like this, looking at an image like this, how do we get involved? It seems that we would have some sort of skill set, albeit not the climate expertise, to make some sort of an impact. So that led us to, in 2015, we received a grant from the US Department of Energy to work on climate issues, particularly in the space of data. So we didn't want to overstep our boundaries of climate expertise. We do not have anyone on staff who identifies in such a way, who has those years of studies under their belts, but we do work a lot with data, and large data at that. So in our research, we had found that around 2012, and 2013, NASA had come out with a pretty important data set, which was the next GDP data set. Many of you are probably familiar with it. More or less, it is daily data for the world over the course of 1950 to 2100, modeling daily precipitation and temperatures, both min and max, for the whole world, right? That's a lot of data. And so that helped. We were asking a lot of questions at the time around data. What data is out there? What does it look like? Is it accessible, and for whom? And can we make it more accessible? So here's a little snippet of some information on the next GDDP data set. It is in a data format called NetCDF. Just curious, how many in this room have heard of the format NetCDF? Awesome, a couple people. Yeah, it is not a very common data set in the span of things, right? It is very specific to large spatial temporal geoscience data sets. In fact, next GDDP is 12 terabytes large. That is a lot more than the common person can analyze or even ingest, right? It covers the world at a 25 kilometer squared resolution. So that's, like I said, a lot of data. And while we had not dealt with NetCDF ourselves, we had an understanding that this data is super important. There was nothing else like it at the time. It was provided by NASA, but there are a lot of other data formats that people are using, right? So, for example, CSV, Excel, right? JSON, which is sort of the data format of the web. Graphs, visualizations, things that are way more accessible. So we thought, okay, what can we do with this data to chop it up and serve it out to people in a more understandable, popular way? Around 2015, a couple years later, LOCA data came out, which is very much in a similar format. It is climate data over the same amount of years for various carbon scenarios, for a bunch of models. However, their algorithm is a little different for downscaling and bias correction. And this seems to be sort of the new standard for climate projection data. So we ingested this one as well. So great, we have this data, we've chopped it up, we've put it in a database, and we've made it more accessible for folks to use, to pull down in JSON and CSV and charts, graphs, visualizations, all this sort of stuff. But it's still a bunch of numbers. What does that mean for the wide range of audience that needs to access climate data? I mean, we have scientists, we have researchers, data analysts that are trained to understand numbers, but people who work in the government under, say, emergency management services or in public health, doing on-the-ground work, might not be able to get to that data as easily. It's still just a bunch of numbers. So we asked ourselves, related to accessibility, like, how do people talk about climate change who work in climate change? How do they talk about climate events, weather events? What terms are they using, and how can we turn those numbers into those terms? Accessibility is really only as true as it is understandable versus just being free and available, like I mentioned. So, like I mentioned, there's many audiences. This is a non-exhaustive list, but we were trying to get into the minds of all these folks who might want to use this data. And we came to the conclusion of climate data indicators. So while that's sort of a terminology, everyone probably understands what are frost days, days below freezing, or 32 degrees Fahrenheit and below. What is average high temperature? Things like that. Terms that people can understand in more of layman's terms. And so the product that I'm talking about is our climate API. And if you've never used an API before, don't fear, don't shut off your ears. It's what I was describing is just our data being put into a database and being able to be easily accessed programmatically. And we built a lab on top of that, which is a way that if you've never programmed in your life, you don't know how to write code, you don't know any of this stuff, you can customize graphs and download data just on a browser. And I'll demo that to you later. A question that you might be able to pose at the API that's pretty simple is how many days will be below freezing in some city, say Philadelphia, in the future? Pretty simple question, pretty approachable. And so for that, we ask the frost days indicator, which makes sense, days below freezing. And I cut out the years 2048 to 2051 arbitrarily, just because that's what fit into the slide. And I chose the high emissions, carbon emissions scenario for this case. So this is a real return on the left from the API, and as you can see, it's in JSON format, and if you don't know what that means, still okay. It's pretty easily readable. You'll see at the top, we have 2048, 2049, 2050, 2051 going down. Those are the years, and underneath you get the data returns. So, for example, in 2048, we can see that the average number of frost days that can be expected in Philadelphia is 60.5 for the year, and so on and so on. So that is that 12 terabyte next GDP data set that has now been piped out into just this one string of data for Philadelphia for these years for frost days. So let me demonstrate to you the lab. Cool. Like I said, the lab is essentially a face in front of the API, so it's a lot easier to use if you've never programmed in your life. And on the left, we have a bunch of indicators for temperature and precipitation. And on the top, you can change your location where you want to look at, different carbon scenarios, our two different data sets, LOCA and next GDP. And if you are more knowledgeable about this than I am, you can customize your models that you will select data from, as well as select units. You can be looking at metric, imperial, even kelvins for the temperature measurements. So let's look at this one. This is pretty understandable. Average high temperature. So we'll be drawing the data from the database, which takes a couple seconds to load. And we get a graph where you can interact with the data directly on the chart like this. So you can see in 2040, we would expect about 68.3 Fahrenheit average high temperature for the year. We see that it goes up over time. We can change the data set. And it's hard to see since they're not side by side, but the data comes back differently. We can slice the data up at a different time scale. I'll show you frost days, the data that we just looked at in JSON format in the years 2048 or so. And you'll see that the data is the same. So here, 2040, oops. Oops. Pardon me. So we're looking at about 60.5 days. That's what our data told us before. So that's where we got that from. And finally, you can download the data as JSON or download the charts themselves to put in your reports, to put in whatever really. And lastly, if you are interested in making a call to the API, we pump out those requests right here. You would just pop this into your terminal if you know anything about programming and get a request that way. Yes?
Does the API has authentication on it, or it's just open to?
Yeah, so what you do is you can sign up for a free account for the API in the lab. I'm logged in here, and so it's authenticated by way of a login and a token, but it's free, so. Yeah, so if you're interested, you can sign up for that at climate.azavia.com, and I'll show that URL later. So great, there's that. You might be wondering or thinking, hey, I've seen tools like that before. This is not new to me. And well, you'd be right. We developed this a couple years back. Like I said, the grant was from 2015, and the NASA data came out in 2012, 2013. And in that space of time, a lot of other folks have come up with similar tools because they recognize this data accessibility issue, right? So many people who wanted to access NEX or LOCA couldn't do it. So you've got the Climate Explorer from the US GCRP in their Climate Resilience Toolkit, Planet OS, prepdata.org. Those are all quite similar to the API. They present their data a little bit differently. But in summary, the data problem, being able to access it outside of the NetCDF, has sort of been solved. And so about 2 years ago, last year, we asked, okay, well, if everyone has solved this issue, is everyone using the data, right? Can everyone who needs to access the data access it? Are they using it? Do they understand it? So we talked to a lot of different folks, trying to dig deeper and answer those questions. We ended up talking to a lot of different cities, planners in different cities, and we came to understand that that's the level that decisions were being made in terms of climate adaptation. And so that's sort of where we zeroed in our efforts. We continued to talk to cities and came to realize that they need more than data. Lots of cities are addressing climate change. And they're trying to report on their climate work. Keyword being trying. So even though the data is more accessible through all these tools that I've talked about, people don't really know what to do with it. And that's valid. There's been increased pressures, both environmental, right? We have events like Hurricane Sandy, people experiencing droughts already, heat waves, etc. But also increased reporting requirements from state level, federal level, etc. There are increased advocacy efforts around adaptation work that would pressure cities also to adapt. Things like America's Pledge, the Covenant of Mayors, and the Climate Reality Project, for examples. There's also been a huge increase of information around adaptation. It's requiring a whole slew of people to suddenly become experts in this space just to do their jobs, right? So someone who is in the emergency management department in a small state suddenly also has to become a climate research expert, or something of that nature. There's a lot of data to wrangle, and it's a lot for everyone to do. In addition to that, a lot of these problems are regional issues. It's not necessarily city-based, right? If you experience effects of hurricanes, it's not you in isolation. It's you and everyone on the seaboard, you know? And so there's a lot of creative invention that doesn't need to be done, right? You can collaborate with folks who are experiencing your similar issues. You might think about private climate consultants. That could be a solution. And for many places, that has been a solution so far. Bigger cities like New York City that have the resources. But a lot of cities aren't New York City and can't provide that in their budgets. And it's also not a long-term sustainable solution, right? We're going to be dealing with climate change from here on out. That's how it is. And so everyone's work has to adapt to that. So in summary of that, we learned that cities just don't feel equipped to address climate change, but they need to, right? And we don't just need another tool to give us the data. We need help. These cities need help to interpret the data and come to something actionable. So all of that led us to partner with ICLEI, ICLEI USA, which is an organization with really deep roots. They've done decades of organizing and are connected to a lot of local governments, and they work on all things sustainability. And so them being our climate experts that we need to delve into this now very climate expert heavy space, we talked a lot with them and with a lot of cities and realized that there are really 3 steps that we could parse the adaptation planning process into. And those are, first, establishing your baseline, understanding what the hazards are to you, weather and climate-wise, right? What is going to change about my locale? What do I have to plan for? More droughts, more heat waves, more hurricanes, extreme precipitation events. After you understand that is understanding what in your communities is vulnerable. Every community is very different, every city is very different, and so assessing what is vulnerable in your locale based on those hazards is your next step. From there, you're able to do something actionable, right? You have assessed what is vulnerable, and now you can target and focus down your attentions, your maybe limited resources to what is most important. And that's your action plan. So all in all, the goal of this next product that I'll talk about is walking a user with maybe a lower level of sustainability work experience through these steps and come out on the other side with a basic action-oriented plan. So, very exciting. This is our new product called Temperate. It is your Adaptation Planning companion, and it's technically going to be released tomorrow. Tomorrow's the release date, but I will give you an exclusive walkthrough today. Let me just do something really quickly. To get us set up. Ooh, I'm not on the Wi-Fi, it looks like. Hold on a second. Yeah, I'll need to use the Wi-Fi.
You can use Drexel against it.
Yeah, it's telling me that I'm not connected.
You just put in your email address, whatever email address.
Okay.
You can also set up a hotspot on my phone.
Let's see. Okay, I got it. Thank you. So hold on a minute while I get this set up. So our URL is temperate.io, and I've already signed up, so I'll just log in. And I won't give you a full walkthrough on every step here in the app, but I'll tell you the most important parts. I think what's really powerful about this tool is that it takes all these sorts of different sources of information, both quantitative and qualitative, and puts them all in this one place and makes it really consumable. And it brings you from just data all the way through to action. So you walk out with your own action plan. In addition to that, since we've partnered with ICLEI, they are providing climate consultation on the go through this app. So at any point, you can send an email and get personalized help from an actual climate consultant at a way reduced price. So starting off here, we're in the app. You have to create your organization because this is an organization-specific plan. And we'll start with choosing our city. Let's say we're Philadelphia, because we are. And I'll just call this that, just for filler. From there, you set up your plan, your adaptation plan. Choose a date. Adaptation plans are usually for a few years, and so I'll just do that. Let's say we'll be done in a year, or 2 years. And here's where we get into it, right? So we want to give you a leg up. We want to give you a baseline to work off of. And we're looking at the short term, up to the years 2030, because most people are right now are planning for this short term. It's hard to look to 2100. And so we automate you understanding your baseline through various resources, the US GCRP's National Climate Assessment, as well as the Climate API that I talked about earlier is feeding data into this. And so in the region of the Mid-Atlantic, you can see we've got these main hazards. Hurricanes, extreme hot days, heat waves. For you who live here, this probably makes a lot of sense to you. You've felt this. You've felt the more heat waves. You've felt crazier rainstorms, river flooding, etc. And as you can see, there's some metrics that come through. So heat waves, we are expected by 2030 or so to experience about 3 more per year. This is all coming from the LOCA data. If you know that your area experiences other hazards that aren't maybe listed, you can go through this list. These hazards are accumulated from the CDP, Carbon, and the California Adaptation Guide that have been doing a lot of this forward work. So let's say I'm pretty content with this, but I'll just take a few off to make it easier here. Cool. So continue on. So now that I understand that those hazards are what's going to affect me where I am, I, as an adaptation planner in my city, know my city very well, and I need to connect the hazards to my city. So then we have to pick community systems, right? What is going to be most vulnerable where you are? And in Philadelphia, there's a whole list here, and it comes from the same resources. You could pick all of them, honestly, but let's just pick a few for demonstration's sake. So let's say public health, public safety, as well as energy delivery, maybe emergency services. So that's what I'm maybe most interested in. Finish. So this app will then set up your plan, connecting those two aspects that we just looked at. And you'll get pumped out to this dashboard, which will track your progress. It doesn't look too interesting now because we haven't done any work in it yet, but you'll see here that we've got a bunch of new risks that have just come out of the hazards and community systems we picked. So extreme hot days on emergency services, heat waves on energy, etc. Great. So this is sort of our first step in setting up our basic plan. So from these risks, we can only do so much work, right, as a city. We only have so many resources, we only have so much time, and we need to prioritize. What we have to do in order to prioritize these risks is assess them. And by assessing them, we'll be able to get a relative ranking between them all. So let's assess this one. Extreme hot days on emergency services. I've definitely seen this in the news. This happens every year. So we've already identified our risk. We can fill in a bunch of other information about it as we go along through this wizard, and I won't do every step. But this step is particularly important because it shows that in the evaluation of the risk, you're not doing it on your own. You're doing it with data. And so we actually pipe in essentially the lab and the climate API to give you the data right here. So as you're evaluating the potential impacts and your capacity to adapt, you can see the data right here. So let's say we're looking at average high temperature. We kind of see it go up over time. This is just a small snippet. And then these are more years. And there's other indicators that you could look at here too, but I'll save you that. So after you go about ranking all of these, and I won't, I'll just skip through this really quickly because you don't need to see this. Next. You'll see this new orange square. This square represents kind of the accumulated ranking of what we just filled out. So eventually, if you can imagine you filling out all these risks and assessing them, you'll get all sorts of rankings, from yellow all the way up to red, based on how well you can adapt to it, if you're able to fit it within your resources, etc. From there, we've kind of done steps 1 through 2 of our 3-step resilience work. And from there we can take action. So obviously I won't evaluate all the risks in front of you, we'll just work on this one. And in our discussions with all these cities, it seemed that they spent a lot of time doing research on what other cities are doing. A lot of people are duplicating this research. So when we designed this feature in particular, we wanted to address that in particular. So in that work, we came across Dr. Missy Stoltz. She works for ASAP, which is the American Society of Adaptation Planners. And in her dissertation research, very conveniently, she came up with a whole database of strategies of 43 cities in the United States, cities, tribes, and counties, actually, and adaptation work that they had been doing over the last decade or so. And so we piped that into the app. So when you take any action here, you get an option to look at suggested actions. And so that will all come up here. So you see Salem, Baltimore, Albany, those are all in the region around Philadelphia, right, the mid-Atlantic. And that's where these are being pulled from. And they're not necessarily meant to be copy and paste to do the same thing as other cities, but at the very least, connect you to new ideas, see what other people are doing, and form collaborations between cities, right? Because none of us are dealing with these issues in isolation, and we have oftentimes similar systems, train systems, transportation, senior housing, etc., that can all be, strategies of which can all be shared. So for example, let's say I like this one from Salem. Installing backup power sources to maintain power during failure. I love it, perfect. So I will choose it. And so from there you can customize it. Maybe I don't need all of this. I'll just delete this text. Boom. You can fill out details about it, the type of action, if you're working toward a goal. More importantly, if you want to share your actions that you're going about with other cities and other organizations that use temperate, because, so I showed you that suggested actions list. That is a living database. It will grow as much as our users want it to grow, and it will stay active and new and up to date as much as users allow it to. So as far as cities want to share their actions, there will be that much more collaboration. So that's right here. But of course we understand if there are, actions that don't want to be released to the public yet, that sort of thing. So you can go through, add more information such as outcomes you expect of this action. You can categorize it here. We even include funding information from the University of Maryland's Environmental Finance Center. It's a really good support tool and has a lot of concrete ideas on where to pursue funding for adaptation actions. So back to the dashboard, you'll see that we've been making progress, right? So we have a bunch of risks. We've assessed one and we've assessed an action step. Pretty great. But the most important part of this all, as you keep track of these actions and feel empowered to make your plan and do adaptation work, is that you have the plan for yourself. It's not for us. It's not just to keep in the app forever. You want to be able to access it, so you can download it as a CSV, which is a really common data format that people use. And that's your whole plan, all of your actions, everything that you've been doing, your risks. You can also even submit it to ICLEI, who are the climate consultants that we partner with in this app, so they can review your work and collaborate with you and make it a better plan. And like I mentioned, throughout the whole process, you can contact ICLEI at any point. Now, unlike the Climate API, Temperate is a paid subscription project. It does have a 15-day free trial, though. So if you do want to poke around, or if you know anyone who might be interested in this, send them our way, send them to temperate.io, and they will have a 15-day free subscription. So, in conclusion, over the last 5 years of our work, we've come up with a couple of tools, and so have many others in this space. And the issues have changed a lot, right? They've moved from, can we access the data, really basic data accessibility, to more complicated, nuanced data accessibility and usability. We came up with the Climate Lab and API. We have other tools out there like Planet OS and NOAA's Climate Resilience Toolkit. Locadata came out in that time, which is an improved version on the next GDDP. And then toward data usability and adaptation, we came up with Temperate. And this is new and fresh. We hope that Temperat's usefulness will grow over time with more users and more actions being populated. I think the strengths of it are there with taking all of these disparate data sources and making it usable, actionable, and having it grow so that it can be collaborative through time. So I encourage you to go to climate.azavia.com and play with it if you so desire. As well, Temperate, like I mentioned, has a 15-day free trial, and that's at temperate.io. So if you have any questions, I'll be here. You can raise your hands or maybe type in the webinar, and that's my email, jfung@azavia.com. So thank you, everybody.
So let's take questions.
So the city of Philadelphia covers more than a 25 by 25 kilometer area, or planners might be interested in a larger area than that. So I'm curious if you all have designs on producing maps of a county or like larger regional area.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way we parse the data was such that we centered it around a point. And so that's how we arrive at the cities, right? As a point representing a city and a 25-kilometer square area. We have talked about making the API more regionally based. I think that was your question. If we plan on accommodating for regions.
Right, essentially, could you say I'm interested in temperature and get more than one grid cell worth of information?
Oh, I see. Yeah, actually, no, this is a different question. Haha. We have been working on this with another team at the company that does focus on more, I guess, regional spatial data. It's a different tool called GeoTrellis. If you're interested in that, definitely come talk to me or shoot me an email. That's something we've been actively working toward that I didn't present on, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
So just to follow up on that, so that would mean that if I were interested in, a city at the seashore next to a big mountain,
Sure.
and so at the top of the mountain, it's a different set of risks than down at the seashore.
Yeah.
I'm going to get your algorithm is going to sort of integrate between both, right? So if it's less than, let's say, 12.5 kilometers to get to the top of the mountain,
Yeah.
I'm going to get both sets of risks.
Well, it's only as good as the data set itself. So we pull from Loca and Nex, and depending on how they calculated that cell, if they accounted for the elevation, if elevation is not necessarily a direct correlation to the data in the cell, I think, especially in a cell that is as complicated as the one that you're talking about, I would say. It really depends how they calculated that. So we don't really have control over that, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
I have a question about the risks. You have different risks and they can be sometimes interdependent. And you mentioned like you prioritize the risk, so how do you prioritize? Is there the user is going to select which risk to deal with first?
Yeah, so let me pull that up. In a way, you prioritize it yourself by how you evaluate those risks for your area. But we prioritize it by giving you sort of this, algorithm, which is sort of it's a lot simpler than it sounds, but essentially we prioritize it by these two factors, potential impact and adaptive capacity. So if you are more able to adapt to it, then we'll make it a higher priority because it's lower hanging fruit. You're more able to address it. That is in conjunction with the potential impact. If it's going to be a high impact risk and you're able to adapt to it, then we'll put it as high priority. And the opposite is true. Yeah. Yes.
So, a question regarding regards to the resolution of the data.
The resolution, yes.
Especially like in two phases. One is a spatial resolution and one is temporal resolution.
Mhm.
So, for example, we want to do some modeling for like ideology modeling.
Yes.
So we typically focusing on temporal resolution that is like at least hours. So, like from the data that you presented, like I saw the only like daily data.
Yeah, that's the lowest temporal resolution of the data is daily.
Okay.
It's one value for the whole day. Mhm.
Okay. So, and that is actually downscaled from the global data set.
Mhm.
And that is downscaled in the spatial resolution to 25K.
Yes, that's the case in next GDDP. I think LOCA is somewhat lower, or I guess higher of resolution, so smaller than 25 kilometers squared.
Okay, and
Yeah.
that is so how was this downscale process? Is it using our original climate model, or it's stochastic process?
Yeah, the better person to ask would be the paper on LOCA. Yeah, it's a pretty complicated process. My best understanding is LOCA downscales using more regional data than the NASA data set, which makes it more powerful because it takes into account just the areas around it to sort of adjust for bias, whereas for NASA, it was drawing more from similar outputs from the models from across the world, which has sort of less relevance. Yeah.
So just to clarify, like return to the question of resolution and
Yes.
location, when you present information for a city, it's not some statistical representation of the grid cells that would all be near that city, it's just the central grid cell for the city.
Yeah, basically, I mean, climate happens over sort of like a larger scale. So if you compare within a city, like two adjacent cells, their climate output probably is not so different, unless of course it is a case of like extreme elevation differences or what have you. That's definitely a simplification we made for the API and for the amount of data reduction.
So the statistical values, like when you presented the number of fast days, there was a mean and a maximum.
Yeah.
Those came from the different global models that were being downscaled.
Exactly, right. So the average is, well, the average of all the models, and then you pull the minimum and maximum. Those data points are also customizable in the API. You can make percentiles, amongst other things. I just pulled out those three. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a question. So how dynamic and alive is this in that, like, as new projections come out, new models are produced, are you updating the data, or are we stuck with that data set unless you get another grant from DOE to update it?
Yeah, I mean, the data doesn't change that frequently. NASA Next came out in 2012, 2013, and that was, I mean, they don't update that data set. LOCA came out in 2015, similarly there. I heard about a newer data set called MACA, which we have not added because it doesn't seem to have as much traction overall. If we get more funding and there is more data to come out, it would be a great add to the API, but no new data as of yet.
So there's no plan to update at this point as...
Yeah, because there's no new data.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And do you also house historic data here, or we can only go forward?
Yeah, the data sets include historic data up to 1950. So a range.
So that's the global data set, anywhere in the world back
Yes.
to 1950?
Yes. LOCA is only actually for the United States and a little bit of Mexico, and the NASA Next data set covers the world. Mm-hmm.
Are there online questions? So I'll ask you another bigger picture question. It was interesting because you made that comment about how early on, like, so cities, they're hiring consultants, which you can see it happening every day.
Yeah.
It's interesting. this stuff is, you've succeeded in making this data so accessible that actually you've enabled consultants. Like, consultants could sort of work right off of this. I mean, it makes it easier to, so where, you know, as the programmer or the designer of this platform, where would you like to see, you know, what points could you interact with researchers to keep the research flowing into the platform, to flow into the practitioners? Where do you see the needs?
Yeah, our manager, Jess, would be way more able to answer this question. I mostly just write features.
It's a difficult question. I'm just curious, like, you know, and having played with this a bit yourself, I'm guessing,
Yeah.
you know, you know that there are certain places where it would be great, like if we could have continuous expert
Input, yeah.
input in certain areas. Like, it's really interesting to me, the adaptation process, you've got the experts, so basically on the fly, you've got people putting in this Likert scale evaluations of, which is really interesting to me. So you've got the expert input happening on the way. But that's sort of in the adaptation context. What about on the data side?
Yeah, on the data side, great question. I imagine as we continue to work on this app, grant permitting, we will continue to, with all of our connections, be kind of pushed in that direction, right? Because as people are using this and are actually doing the on-the-ground work, they'll be like, this app is missing this new aspect now, right? We don't just talk about hazards anymore, we talk about hazards and why. And that we're really adaptable to. Our partners at ICLEI are really deeply involved in this space, and they're helping to lead this app they have through the whole process. Honestly, we're really open to changing the app as time goes on. I already know that we have some plans in mind, particularly in making the suggested actions feed more robust, because it seems to be like a really strong feature of the app.
Nobody's asking more questions. I don't know what to.
Yes, go ahead, Franco.
So I think I saw somewhere coastal flooding.
Yes.
But I don't think I saw data on sea level rise. Is
Good question.
that not in this at this point?
It is not here at the moment. We have been working on the side on more sea level rise analysis, which includes maps, because that's really important to understanding that, right? And sea level rise is especially conducive to maps. There's a lot of other tools out there, a lot of other competitors in that space that have done a really good job with that information, so we're still trying to figure out how else can we be useful in a way that hasn't already, been done in a ton of different places. Like Sea Level Rise Explorer is a really great resource. I will throw that out there. I really respect them. They've done really good work.
But that data is not available at the scale at which you could ingest it into the system?
I think it would be a separate feature. The data for sea level rise is not exactly,
More
it
regional.
requires more, it's definitely more regional, it's at a way finer scale, right? Because at that point you're worried about particular buildings in your city being affected or not.
Right.
You'll know if you're coastal or not, and if you have to deal with that in a general sense, but you need to know down to the building level. Yes.
So, go ahead.
Just a couple of questions around the lab. First, like, what did you write what code did you use to write the graphics in?
Oh, the graphs are done in D3.js, and the app itself is built in Angular.
And then how is the receptivity to the API? I got a username, played around with it maybe 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Worked with NetCD, updated myself, and so I
Cool.
don't have the need for it. But I'm curious, who you found to be using the API, or is it just really serving internal purposes?
Yeah, we're looking constantly for feedback because as many people who might use it, they don't necessarily come back to us and talk to us about it. So if you do use it, please send me an email. But yeah, it really, as far as I know, we definitely pipe it into Temperate, and I think this will be like a primary way that data gets used. Yeah. Yes.
I wasn't sure if you were able to speak to at all, like the initial needs assessment, if that was done on the ICLEI side of things, but like, what do the end users need, if there was any sort of testing that was done with prospective users?
For temperate particularly?
Yeah.
Yeah, so definitely this product was not born out of our own minds. It was completely in conjunction with ICLEI. They work with all sorts of local governments on all things sustainability. And a problem they were having themselves is seeing cities needing to come up with plans and do reporting, and people power can only do so much. You would have to hire more people to get that same breadth. And so this is sort of where this app comes in, is filling a lot of that gap and elevating people and planners all over to do a lot of that themselves, of course with support from ICLEI. We talked to dozens and dozens of cities about their needs for this. We did a lot of research before we even came up with wireframes in the first place for what this app could do. And in the last few weeks, as the product has reached sort of a finish point, we've come back to those cities and done user testing and have received really good feedback. People who are going to be early adopters, so that's really exciting. Mm-hmm.
There are all sorts of other hazard mapping tools, maps out there. Are you going to remain sort of laser focused on climate risks in particular, or will this could some future variation on this look at other hazards overlapping on the climate hazard?
Yeah, no, we'd definitely be interested in all of that. Some of our work is climate grant dependent. We're actually waiting for a grant to come through next week, fingers crossed. If you have funding sources, let us know. But yeah, we have actively been doing research on sea level rise analysis and integrating that into the app, but that didn't make it into this versions of it. We have been looking at regional analyses and having, because a lot of organizations aren't just city focused, but they're regional, like the I always forget the acronym, DVPRC, the Delaware River Planning Commission, and that covers a couple of states around here. Users like that would need sort of other analytical tools. So yeah, we definitely have our eye on that, accepting suggestions. We're sure it'll change over time as people actually use it and tell us we need something else, or rather they need something else from us. Yes.
I just want to ask a question about API.
Yes.
So when you do the API query,
Yes.
is it possible to just get the regional data instead of one data format? So in other words, like a query for the location, is it possible to give a regional location?
No, not at this moment. We do have, however, I think I had answered a question earlier where about regional data, and we have been doing work, but sort of behind the scenes now with another tool we have that does more regional, that is better with handling regional data, because JSON is not really that great for that. And it will serve it out in, what was the title format? I believe GeoTIFFs. I don't know if you work with GeoTIFFs, but that's a better data format for large amounts of regional data. So yeah, if you're interested in that, shoot me an email and I'll connect you. Yeah.
Okay. No other questions? No. Great, this is really interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you so
I'm glad.
much for doing it.
Yeah, you're so welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Stuff, so we get a preview, so it's